So before we jump into today's conversation, we have a wonderful guest, by the way. Let's admit something very uncomfortable. As a people, as a continent, even as a species, we've always had a soft spot for violence. I'm not talking that Freddy Krueger or what's the guy from it, Pennywise, yeah? Not the gory stuff, but more the symbolic kind, you know? The dramatic kind, obviously. The kind that says, you will respect me now. Yeah.
You know, it's true. From, the Old Testament to Hollywood, there's this strange reverence for the moment someone would actually, snap. Moses smashing the tablets at the bottom of Mount Sinai, Achilles dragging Hector, Liam Neeson with a special set of skills. It's like we trust violence more than we trust process.
I'll hunt you down. I will find you. I will hunt you down. But we also, in that same, if I can quote something from like Taken, we also romanticize it. I suppose culturally here, things like Gai Boro, yeah, that is in every Kikuyu household. And that was basically a phrase that you heard before a slipper was thrown at you. Yeah. And if it was to look at that as a government, that's basically the policy decision has been made. It has been immediate. It is unilateral. And there is no right for appeal at all.
Yeah. Or, even in school, remember that one teacher, your literature class, you remember with that one cane named Constitution? Even our metaphors were violent. We were taught that pain and discipline were twins. And the state just inherited that logic.
And also, if you look at the way our generation was actually brought up, I speak for myself anyway. Yeah. We were fed a diet of basically revolutions, coups, action films. I didn't mind the action films. I do remember the 1982 coup, though.
Yeah.
Obviously, I was not around for any revolution. But we tried to start a few in school. But depending on your actual neighborhood, depending on your actual neighborhood, sometimes you actually went through all these three in the same day. By the time tear gas is being thrown to you as one of the Wananchi, it almost starts to feel like a rerun.
But here's the plot twist. When violence starts to wear a uniform, when it starts to carry a budget and quote the law, it stops being thrilling. It's just plain terrifying.
Because then it's no longer a story really, is it? Yeah, It's your street, it's your protest, it's your kid. And suddenly you're asking, wait, who gets to decide what a criminal actually is? Or who the criminal actually is?
So today, we're taking a step back. Not just talk about violence and what it is, but who gets to use it and why that even matters.
And we're not here to actually glamorize the punch, right? We're actually going to examine the glove and to ask what gives the glove legitimacy and what happens when that glove starts to punch below the belt.
So whether you're a fan of Scarface or Shaka Zulu, The Godfather, or just growing up fearing Nduria Polisi, this one's for you.
From Cairo to Cape Town, Lagos to Lamu, 54 nations, one continent, countless perspectives. Hi, my name is Warren Njoroge.
I'm Nduoko.
Welcome to Panel 54, Global Perspective Through an African Lens. This is the podcast where we unpack power, policy, people, and the paradoxes that define our time, with nuance, with history, and a deliberate commitment to context. This isn't punditry, it's perspective. It's not a briefing, it's reframing, and it starts right here. So the week that was, what do you have on your docket?
Well, it was many things that we're looking at this week, isn't it? So the President of the United States invited a number of people to the White House. A number of countries, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Mauritania, and what was the other one?
Gabon. Yeah.
Of course, small population. So, of course, the question is, what's the thrust behind the visit? And he was very interested in letting them know that the 10% tariff increase was not going to affect them. And he would ask why. So it was fun because, they were there in the White House and there were many things that were said. And it's interesting that he picked these smaller populated nations from regions whereby there are bigger players. However, it was also, I don't know if I want to use the word strange, to see that they lauded him. They praised him.
Everybody has it every time they go in there.
One way or another. They praised him for inviting them and then also fostering economic development and growth.
Okay, but that was interesting. I don't think anybody has really... I'm sure they have, but it was interesting that he did choose much smaller countries, which actually don't... I don't think you'd feel the 10%. They would...
rarely happen.
You
So, I
know?
mean, look at where Senegal is situated. Look at where Liberia is situated, Gabon, one of the countries in the Super 8 for France at that time. And then Mauritania, which many people had said had an insurgent government in place, or parallel government to what democracy commands. And then Guinea-Bissau, which, after one of the 3 Lusophone countries on the continent, and many would ask, what's its push point in terms of economic development?
Okay, but
I think that
what they said they're exempt from it.
Yes,
That's what he said there.
Yes,
they're actually
yes,
exempt, and this
they're
was
exempt
on
from
the
it.
on the 9th of July. But basically, it looks like a strategic pivot in U.S.-Africa relationships. But it's very selective.
There's always an end game. I think that there's maybe something else.
Oh, ye of little faith.
Oh, ye of what's the word we're looking for? Theory.
Yeah. Well, if the past has proven anything, anyway, I guess maybe once bitten, twice shy.
Indeed, of
Right.
course.
So I want to move to Nigeria. Right, the death and burial of Nigeria's
Muhammadu Buhari.
Muhammadu, yes, Buhari. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he was laid to rest on the 15th of July in Daura. That is in Katsina State.
Yes, in the northern part of Nigeria.
Yeah, and that's his hometown. In a ceremony attended by President Tinubu and regional leaders, a few other national mourning. A week of national mourning was held. Yeah. How long had he been in power?
He'd been in power. This is interesting because he's been president of Nigeria twice. He ruled Nigeria during the military period. So he served as a military president and then came back and served as a military man in a civilian government. So that was interesting because he had a double stint at it. Many said that under Buhari's leadership, he took us. Under his leadership or under his administration, the second one. The first one, nobody had an opportunity to speak.
Exactly.
But in the second one, we saw that he came in after Goodluck Jonathan, essentially had made strides, economically developmental strides.
Okay, so he was riding on his coattails.
Unfortunately, then took Nigeria into a recession, into regression. So it was interesting because we did hear his wife speak just after his death and say that before he died, he asked me to apologize to the Nigerian people.
Guilt.
Or something.
So
Yeah.
apologize for what?
Because
No, she should have been more specific.
She should have been more specific.
You know?
What exactly do you speak of? This is the case. He was laid to rest. I mean, and he will be remembered, I think, for that, serving, straddling 2 regimes where he served in the military government, and the zeitgeist of the day was, don't ask, don't tell, do as you're told, or, you can be disappeared. And then coming to serve in a civilian government where Nigerians were more woke.
Yeah, it lends itself to that conversation about violence, basically in Africa, and whether it's a cultural thing, whether it's governance, whether it's constitution, whether it's rule by the sword.
Yep.
A lot of it centers around that. Right, moving on swiftly. Presidents for life. Presidents for life. Cameroon is an interesting country.
Yes, it is. And there is a man, he is to turn 93 soon.
Yes.
His name is Paul Biya.
Yep.
He has decided he's going to run again for presidency. I'm at a loss for words because in his last term, it seemed as if things were a bit shaky. And we're just speaking from a physiological point of view here. And how long are we going to hold on to power? We see that reminiscent in West Africa, especially with Paul Biya. And in terms of what he has or not been able to do, one of the big issues is whether he's been able to unite Francophone and Anglophone Cameroon, whereby Francophone Cameroon surrounds Anglophone Cameroon. And the French influence still very strong there, with the minority seeking for recognition, from government. And
but
the minority in this case being Anglophone.
It also then brings a question as to whether there's actually any democratic renewal at all. Is anything democratic about it?
Well, I mean, you have a man who's 92 years old and he's, many, from all intents and purposes, may be very close to giving up his ghost. You're going to have to ask questions around whether democracy actually reigns.
And was it where recently we had riots was it Sao Tome?
Yeah.
Where president had declared that he's going to scrap the constitution and basically say he's going to
be there for as long as he wishes.
Yeah, basically. Power corrupts?
And absolute power corrupts, absolutely.
Fair enough. Right. Something that people might not have seen coming out of, well, yeah, maybe not have seen coming, but the DRC and Rwanda, yeah, it might be a bit back, a bit further back, but the U.S. did facilitate peace agreement that was signed in Washington, bringing DRC and Rwanda closer to resolving long-standing conflict in eastern Congo. It calls for troop withdrawal, militia disarmament, and regional economic integration.
Call me conspiracy theorists.
Shoot.
Because we know that nations very rarely dabble in these negotiations which don't have anything to their benefit. The conflicts in the central part of Africa have been resource conflicts forever.
Always will be.
Anybody getting involved is there to...
Not out of the goodness of their heart.
Definitely not.
Definitely not out of the goodness of their heart. Another story is coming out from the U.S. deportees sent to Eswatini. Yeah, the U.S. has begun sending migrants convicted of serious crimes to Eswatini under a safe third country deportation policy. This marks a controversial extension of U.S. immigration tactics into Africa.
The receiving side, government of Eswatini, are they a receptacle here and saying that we are accepting this? Or is it just, well, okay, here's the African continent, pick a spot. Eswatini sounds great, send them over there.
They might not be on the 10% tariff.
Voila.
Food for thought.
Indeed.
Food for thought.
Power is often framed as something given, but in most African states, it's always taken. Taken through force, maintained through fear, justified through law. But what happens when the very institution meant to protect us becomes the source of harm?
That's a very interesting question, because today on panel 54, we're asking the question that most governments really do not like to hear. Who has a right to use violence, and what actually makes it legitimate? We're joined today by Professor Peter Kagwanja, who is a constitutional strategist, foreign policy advisor, an author of War for Peace, a man who has basically helped write both the scripts for the state and the blueprint to restrain that same state. From police batons to protest bars, state collapse to structural exclusion, this is a conversation about the sharp edge of power and the fragile foundation of legitimacy.
The violence isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like policy. Sometimes it's just law passed in parliament that never reaches the village. This is not about what the state can do. It's about what it must never forget, that legitimacy is not built through fear. It's built through trust.
So there we have it. We've now framed what the stakes are all about, right? Violence is not just random, actually. It is actually organized more often than not. It is justified, and really, we've seen a lot of it. It's often perpetrated by the state and is actually state sanctioned sometimes as well. But what does it mean for violence to be legitimate? What does that term actually mean? Yeah, what is legitimate violence, and who actually gets to decide it? Is a more important question.
So let's start with some definitions. Prof. Max Weber called the modern state the entity that claims the monopoly on a legitimate use of physical force. But that idea, born in industrial Europe, doesn't always map neatly into the African context, where statehood itself is a contested inheritance. From your lens as a political theorist and state strategist, how would we understand legitimate violence in Africa today?
If I would start by taking through the new experiment in Kenya with constitutionalism, which is at the heart of our 2010 constitution, there is a section that basically describes what we would call the instruments of power and when they're supposed to be handed over, and how they're supposed to be handed over, and who is supposed to be there. So it's a big issue about the swearing in of a new head of state who will have won an election, and therefore he's sworn legitimately. So that drama takes place at the appointed time by the Constitution, and witnessed by the Chief Justice and everybody. For me, the initial part was, what are these instruments of power? And interestingly, there are only two. One is the Constitution, and the other one is the sword. And those two tell the story of what is the state about?
Okay.
The state is about the rule of law, on the one hand, signified by the Constitution, and the use of violence, signified by the sword. So it's the values that you are protecting that are important. And what we are seeing happening in many of our African countries, including Kenya here, is that you are not just violating the Constitution, but you are also using the sword, destroying soft power and using hard power to stay on in power and impose your will on the people outside the purview of democracy. This is the case of Somalia after the 1981 civil war. You can say for a while it was the case of Liberia, it was the case of Sierra Leone and many African countries where the state, collapses and it is left at the mercy of, militias fighting each other.
So on that note, I needed to ask, sorry to interrupt you, I was looking at the sword, the word sword. It's a symbol of violence in itself, or emancipation, like you said.
Yes.
But now the numbers tend to speak for themselves, especially when you look at the sword side of things. And they show up because there's a statistic here, according to the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, right? State forces in Africa were responsible for over 8,000 incidents of political violence. This was in 2023 alone. That is more than all non-state armed groups combined, right? So the question then becomes, when the state uses more force than the actual rebels it's fighting, or the people it's trying to put in line, what does this say about its claim to legitimacy? You said sometimes it becomes immoral. And is that still governance in any form or manner? Or are we then drifting into a kind of state-led warfare against dissent?
It all depends on what claim the state has to power, to legitimacy. If we could take the example of Uganda, Museveni would claim total violence as the domain of the political system he has set up since 1986 when he came to power. And that's what they call the revolutionary violence. And the question becomes, at what point should revolutionary violence be accountable to the people themselves? Because, take it from me, all power, all authority, all sovereignty come from the people. What we have seen is in Africa, and what is literally a paradox, is that people come to power through the ballot. But unfortunately, they live through power through the bullet. And that itself is a huge paradox. Take, for example, in Kenya, we spent a lot of time counting votes to ensure who wins. But after you have won through the power of the people, expressed through the ballot, then you wake up one morning and say that Kenyans are better off having only one leg. But it tells you
there's an underlying there's a tone. There's an underlying tone there.
There's an underlying tone, and it is very it is very ties in with what we are saying here. That if you're using violence against the people, then your leadership automatically becomes illegitimate.
Okay.
So then, how can citizens tell the difference between what is a state that is protecting and one that is suppressing, especially when the lines between policing and punishment are so thin?
If you could go by an example, and you go to Uganda, 1970 to 1979, those dark years in the history of Uganda, Amin would do anything. Idi Amin Dada would do anything to maintain his to deal with his enemies, real or imagined. And therefore, so many Ugandans were killed during that period. And therefore, any form of violence that rose up in resistance to Idi Amin became legitimate, including the invasion by Tanzania. And the debate was made internationally: is Tanzania, doing the right thing to support Ugandans who are fighting against Idi Amin, who that time was described as the legitimate leader of Uganda? And the Tanzanians said, we cannot stand by and watch as this man butchers his people, who are also our people, because we are East Africans. So you can now begin to see the crash of violence in Pururo, that the violence of the oppressor and the violence of the oppressed. One is emancipatory, the other one is repressive.
If you look at it from that perspective, that power balance, how do you restrain it?
There is no other way other than returning power to the people. And the way to do that is to begin reconstituting the state in a manner that it is accountable to the people. It may not be in line with what you can call the liberal democracy, but you have examples. The violence between the British colonialists and the American so-called Pilgrim Fathers or Founding Fathers, that violence was resolved in Pennsylvania by the people asserting their own rights. Because if a group of people occupy the state and now begin to use the state for their own ends, to sustain their own power, to accumulate wealth, and at the same time to trample upon the will of the people, then there is a word for that. And the word is the criminalization of the state.
Who holds them accountable then?
Now that is the dilemma. Now, and the Romans expressed it at one point. Who guard the gods? That is the big question in history. And the gods can only be guarded by the people. So when the people rise up, as they have always done across civilizations, these are what are called revolutions. And that's why over time, revolutions have begun to have this, moral aura around themselves. This, silver lining in what would be a very dark crowd. Revolutions are emancipatory, and they're supposed to establish an order that is pro-people. And that is why the American Revolution, which was a very bloody one, the French Revolution, perhaps the bloodiest of all, the Chinese Revolution that takes almost 20 years plus, our Mau Mau movement in Kenya, that liberation war, and more recently the war against Idi Amin in Uganda. All these are seen as revolutions, and they are embraced by the people as emancipatory, and therefore they give violence a new tint.
Does it give it legitimacy?
Not necessarily legitimacy, but a new tint.
Okay.
Now, more if you can come to closer home to our century, when we look at the Sahel, the whole of the Sahel, we began the debate, and I was part of that debate about the good coups and bad coups. When coups are emancipatory, in a sense that they liberate people from very well established and known oppressive system, whether it is economic oppression, political oppression, or social oppression, then here we are now beginning to talk about the gun or the bullet being on the side of salvation.
Okay.
And where an established order, what you can call law and order, is actually a criminal order.
Right.
Okay. So the French and their henchmen or henchwomen in West Africa are now said by most of the people on the African continent to have retained a system that needed to have gone in the 1950s.
Okay.
And it is still surviving into the new century. So that's where the line comes
comes together. So then we see law and order is maintained. All of this usually falls under the auspices of a constitution.
Yes.
Kind of like what you've mentioned as one of the instruments. The other instrument that you talk about then is, the sword.
Yeah.
Is there ever a balance that can be struck? When we look at African states, for example, is there ever a balance that can be struck where the tenets of a constitution, for example, are upheld and the use of force violence through the sword is limited? Is there a balance that can be struck between the two?
Yes, there is always a balance. Take it this way. There is only one space in this country and on the continent and possibly globally where one building, one structure the doors of that structure are never closed. That's the police station.
Okay.
Yeah. At no time will you ever see the doors of a police station shut. Why? Because we are perpetually watching to ensure the security of our country. And therefore, we expect that one person or the other will violate the law or is going to infringe on the freedoms of others. And therefore, this is the place they go. But they don't go to be condemned. Mm-hmm. They go to be subjected to the tests that we have read for ourselves as to establish who is and who is not a criminal. So the police now become the prosecutors of this particular case. And they have to put the case on the table that this person has done this, and therefore we put them before the law, and the judge now comes in to pronounce if there is ample evidence to support that. Mm. So it's a process. But now when the same police mm-hmm. assume the role of the arrestor, the person who puts you in detention, and the people who execute you. Mm. And before you even go to the court, you've been executed.
Judge, jury, and executioner.
Yeah, they are judge, jury, and the executioner at the same, rolled in one. Mm. Then we have a problem. When you appear in court maimed, you cannot even speak because you've been beaten to a point that you don't even recognize yourself. Then we are not talking about the rule of law here. Mm. We're talking about the rule of the jungle.
And anarchy.
And anarchy.
If our laws are sound, in terms of how our constitution talks and the constitution of consent, or the constitution of consent, if our laws are sound, all right, but the violence persists, as you have just said, where exactly is the breakdown? Is it police will? Is it institutional capture? Or is it something more cultural, actually? We look at the aspect of culture.
I think you're right on the last point. There is a problem with culture. And that's what one of the professors at the University of Nairobi, I can't remember whether it's Okoth, one of the professors, said you can have a constitution, but you don't have constitutionalism.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the constitutionalism is that culture that underpins the implementation of a constitution. In this regard, if we can talk about Africa in general, we are having a problem of political culture, because we started off with the Westminster system
yes.
Of democracy, mm-hmm. where you elect people and parliament is supreme, and in parliament the parliament appoints government and so on. Then we moved to republican systems where the president, who is the sovereign or who symbolizes the sovereignty of the people. And then came in the one-party state, which changed the whole thing. Mm. And one-party state is what now brought in the cultural aspect of it. Because coercion is not just constitutional, but it's extra-constitutional. In other words, it sometimes derives from certain oppressive culture. And incidentally, that oppressive culture in a number of ways is a continuation of the colonial oppression.
Yeah.
Perpetuated by institutions that were created by colonialism in order to ensure hegemony.
And how do we compare that with other parts of the continent? If you look at Somalia, for example, where the violence that could then be seen as a legitimate force by the state was between two clans, again, culturally.
Yep. Yes.
How then do we see that playing out?
That's why we're saying that when you get to the Sudan, for example, as we transit to Somalia, you find that this is a racial war between the Arabs and the Arabs who now have the Janjaweeds as a militia that they are using, and the black people in Darfur mm-hmm. and other spaces, and therefore Janjaweeds now mutate from a militia that's a criminal militia, killing people and maiming people and destroying property, and basically standing on the way of democracy, to now a legal force within the government that's controlled by one person, the president. So when but Omar al-Bashir collapses, or rather is removed from power, what happens? The Janjaweeds have nobody to control them. And therefore they wage war against the official military. And that is the root of the Sudanese violence.
So if it's controlled, is it acceptable as a means of control?
No. The state, both the Janjaweed and the military in Sudan had a pact, and they controlled the state and prevented, Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok from governing as a representative of the people. And what happens? There are coups. And eventually, we are talking about those wielding violence, both the criminal violence of the Janjaweeds and the official violence of the military. Both are criminalized. And they are all against the people of Sudan. So getting out of the conundrum in Sudan's conflict or civil war, we'll have to reassert the voice of the people. In Somalia, the situation is slightly different. These are clans. They have 4 major clans. And each of the clan armed itself to the teeth to defend its people. And that is the character of the Somali civil war. The civil war was waged on the lines of clans. And therefore, it was easy to make peace when you bring the clan elders and they talk. But the big question that has not as yet been resolved in Somalia is who will wield the power, the military power of the state? Because clans still insist on having their own violence.
What happens when then the people who had initially elected that government start seeing these people as a legitimate government? And now those guys who are now allowed to have the legitimacy in terms of either the violence, or they start seeing Janjaweed as a state, not the actual recognized government that has been put there in power in the first place.
We said at the beginning that what is important is the sovereignty of the people. And whoever supports the sovereignty of the people is essentially the one who is legitimate. Because we have left the epoch when the monarchs were the sovereigns who claimed power through their bloodline. We have come to an age where collectively the people are the sovereign. And that's why certain countries in Africa and across the world put the issue of the people as part of their name, collective name, the People's Republic of. Now, because the people, you need to remind everybody that all power derives from the people. And therefore, it might be what others are calling a criminal gang that successfully defends the will of the people. Like the ANC defending the will of the black people in South Africa against apartheid, which was a legitimate system according to the law.
Yeah.
But the ANC wages a war under the name of terrorism, because it is called a terrorist group. Even the United States, the paragon of democracy, had basically treated the ANC and its leadership as a terrorist gang. So, and Mandela would not be around to go to the United States because he's a criminal. He's a terrorist.
Prof,
yes.
Based on what you said, is then violence inherently African? And I ask this because we have seen other countries wage their wars internally using troops from the African continent. Is it because this is something that Africans are likely to do, prone to violence?
Not really. In fact, when I'm trying to think through the question you've asked, I do a mapping of the world in philosophical terms and what explains the psyche of our people into whether using reason or violence. And there is only one culture where violence or conflict is basically seen as a motor of development, and that's the Western civilization. Whether you are looking at Karl Marx, you are looking at Hegel, and the mighty philosophers, they all say that conflict is inevitable. That's why we are saddled with an opposition, even when it is not sometimes necessary.
Yeah.
Because the system that we have inherited from Western liberalism requires that there's conflict.
So it's inherited, what you're saying?
Yeah.
That this is learned, is this learned behavior?
We have not learned it. Even violence is not learned. Now, when you look at the Oriental thinking, China, India, and others.
I was going to ask, because they're not been put in that conversation.
For them, it's harmony. Harmony means that you might be wearing red, I'm wearing white, the other one is wearing black. My view is this, your view is this, your view is this. The only requirement of you is not to change who you are, but to find harmony within the group.
Within that.
So you are under extreme pressure to coexist with others without going to conflict. When you come to us, whether you're going from ancient Egypt to our modern days, our ultimate thing is justice. It doesn't matter what you do, but have justice at the heart of it. It's not a surprise that it is the African symbol that is universally held as the symbol of justice. The coat of the scales of justice. The scales of justice come from the river Nile. It's our river. And they come from the river Nile, nowhere else. Because the king, the monarch, the pharaoh, was supposed to exercise ultimate justice. And it is the exercise of justice as a ruler that will enable you to get to the next world. Therefore, you carry every day that scale to remind you that you have. And the walking stick, which you use, is the key that you use to open to the next kingdom. So justice is ultimate. How do you get justice? It is when you sit down under a tree, as Mwalimu Nyerere would tell us. You talk and talk until you agree. So our philosophy is absolute consensus.
And in terms of that accountability, then how do you ensure it? We look at what's happened in, a region that you referenced as the Coup Belt in West Africa.
Yep.
We see what's happening, whereby we've seen transitionary governments in the name of Burkina Faso, for example, and a transitional leader has done in a short period of time what leaders over decades were unable to do. And one would say that position came into place with the use of violence. Is that acceptable?
The French and their cronies have been using violence, using the standby
some of the most bloody revolutions, did they not?
Yeah. Inside there, they have been using the militias, the French military and so on, to even coerce the leadership that is in power to do certain things. Because you would be so foolish as to give your all uranium to the French and your people are in darkness. Even if you are such a dadahead, you cannot do that willingly. And this is what Burkina Faso, this is what Niger, this is what they are saying. And why are the new military rulers in West Africa so famous? Because they are fulfilling the two requirements of a sovereign acting on behalf of the people. One is that you are administering justice.
Okay.
Nobody is accusing you of violating the justice of the people. Two, you are creating wealth for the people and uplifting their livelihoods and enabling them to meet their daily needs. So development on the one hand and justice on the other are the two pillars of the people's legitimacy when it is exercised to the full. The problem, for example, in Kenya, did not start with violence. Violence is the final stage of a conflict that in nature was about the economy. It was about livelihoods. It was about the cost of living. It was about the rising cost of fuel. It was about the debt and taxation. And demonstrations in the streets or protests in the street mutated into the responses by the state. And now we are in a political crisis where we are now discussing violence. And it was never supposed to be discussed in the right place, in the first place. And that's where the African Union and ECOWAS found themselves in dilemma. Because you have condoned injustices of the French and the consequent underdevelopment of West Africa. What morality do you have as an African Union or ECOWAS to tell us what is right?
True.
About who shouldn't take power and who should not take power. And ultimately, the two are accused of kowtowing to the French, dictates. And therefore, violence in itself is not a bad thing. it is a good thing as long as it defends the will of the people. It brings about justice and asserts the right to development.
So let me ask this question. From that perspective, is all violence equal?
The balance is essentially the morality. In other words,
so even if you have emancipatory or even revolutionary or strategic or structural,
yes,
provided that it creates an aspect of justice and uplifting.
The end game of a human society is justice.
But structural violence is detrimental to anybody.
No, that's what we're saying, that the ultimate end of every society is to have peace and to have development. And the operation can be different. I taught at Moore University at a certain stage. I was never detained myself. I was never jailed because they came for me one day in my classroom. They did not disrupt my class, my lecture. They just waited for me outside there. And as soon as I got out, they showed me, they just lifted their coats and they showed me the guns, which were under their coats. And they showed me the car. And they were telling me to shut up, not to talk, not to shout. I looked at them and I saw how mean they were. I knew they meant business. I didn't know what I had done. So anyway, I said, this is it. This is the end of it. So I got into that Peugeot 544 and drove those 60 or so kilometers from the main campus to the CID place in Eldoret. Things were told me, what I'm teaching and who I have met among the people I had met, who I was not supposed to have met at any place was someone, Paul Mwite, who was that time the leader of Safina, and so on. And I stayed there for 2 hours, interrogated, but finally they found maybe I'm not what they thought I am, or what they were told I am. And they told me, Daktari. I wasn't a doctor that time. I was just holding a master's, but I was teaching at the university.
Just
they
a
told
master's.
me, Daktari, go back. We'll take you back, but we want you to be reporting here every Monday, so that we have a chat about who you met and what you are going to teach. Those were the only things they wanted. And for a whole year, I reported every Monday. Not according to the law, and in this particular case, I was not coerced, but I was oppressed because I didn't have to do that. So the point here is simply that let's not take that the battle for democracy is won. It has never been won. Take, for example, in Ethiopia, the Tigray War. The Tigray War was about teaching the Tigrayans a lesson. That you have oppressed us, you have ruled us with an iron fist, now you cannot do that again. Then you wage war. The war was initially waged as a law and order enforcement. It mutated into Ethiopia's second civil war.
Yeah.
So again, we are here where some people believe that it's not the constitution to end where we started. It is not the constitution and the rule of law that is supreme. It is the sword that is supreme. The use of the sword is the only guarantee for your survival in power. It is not the constitution. Now, what does that mean? You want an easy way out. You want to govern the people not according to their will, but according to your will. And that eventually leads us to what we don't want to talk about, authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is the best expression of the use of violence and coercion against the people. That's why it's criminal. And that's why we struggle with it.
We'd have to do that as a separate episode altogether.
Indeed.
Maybe we could talk to you for the longest time. Thank you so much, by the way. So as citizens, and you said the power actually rests in the people.
Yeah.
While the constitution is waived as a means to say, yes, I'm trying, but the sword is what is actually now being used to rule. That's actually food for thought. Our compact with the state, as far as I'm concerned, is premised on protection, not persecution. And I think that's very critical to remember.
Right. Violence may always remain in the state's tools, its toolkit, but then you ask the question, how and when it's used must pass the test of justice and not just legality.
Yeah. True. Well, this has been Panel 54, where we rethink the world one African perspective at a time. I'd like to say a very big thank you to our guest, Professor Peter Kagwanja, yes, for walking us through the fault lines, actually. We had a lot more we could have actually talked about. But the lines between power and principle, and it does boil down to principle as far as I'm concerned. So that's it for Panel 54, where we rethink the world one African perspective at a time. I'd like to say a very special thank you to our guest, Professor Peter Kagwanja, for walking us through the fault lines between power and principle. Now, if it made you pause, reflect, or even reframe, share it, start the conversation, and don't forget to tag us in. You can find us on our social media handles at Panel54Pod or on your favorite streaming platform. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a single episode. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and remember to keep the lens clean.